Cop dismisses little girl's cry for help. Then he learns the horrifying truth. The Texas sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Officer Mike Harrison wasn't so bone-tired. He'd been on patrol for 10 hours, dealing with the usual Friday night mix of drunk drivers, domestic disputes, and the occasional cat stuck in a tree. He was looking forward to a cold beer and a rerun of some old western on TV. Mike, at 58, was a veteran of the force in the small town of Havenwood, Texas. He'd seen a lot in his 30 years on the job, enough to make him a little cynical, a little jaded, but underneath it all, he still held onto a core belief in justice. He was a big man, with a weathered face and kind eyes that could harden in an instant when needed. His graying hair was cut short, military style, a holdover from his days in the army. The radio crackled, shattering the quiet hum of his patrol car's engine. Unit 4, we have a report of a juvenile female, approximately 12 years old, wandering alone in Creekside Park. Caller reports she appears cold and distressed. Mike sighed. Creekside Park was a known spot for teenagers to sneak off and drink, smoke, or whatever else teenagers did these days. He figured it was probably just another runaway, a kid trying to make a statement. Still, duty called. 10 to 4, dispatch. En route. He flipped on his lights and siren, more out of habit than necessity. The park was only a few minutes away. As he pulled into the nearly deserted parking lot, he spotted her immediately. She was sitting on a swing set, her small frame huddled against the chill evening air. She wasn't dressed for the weather, wearing only a thin t-shirt and jeans, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Mike pulled up beside the swing set, the headlights illuminating her. She looked up, her eyes wide and frightened. She was younger than he expected, her face pale and streaked with tears. He estimated her to be around 12, as dispatch had said, but there was a fragility about her that made her seem even younger. Evening, Mike said, his voice softer than he intended. He got out of the car, approaching her slowly. You lost, sweetheart. The girl shook her head, her eyes darting around nervously. No, sir. Well, you're out here all alone, and it's getting cold. What's your name? Emma, she whispered, barely audible. Emma, I'm Officer Harrison. Do you live around here? Emma nodded, but she didn't elaborate. Do your parents know you're out here? This question seemed to trigger something in her. Her eyes filled with tears again, and she shook her head vigorously. Please, don't take me home, she begged, her voice cracking. Please. Mike frowned. This was starting to feel like more than just a typical runaway. But he'd been down this road before. Kids ran away for all sorts of reasons: arguments with parents, bad grades, a boyfriend or girlfriend their parents didn't approve of. He'd learned not to jump to conclusions. Emma, I can't just leave you here. It's not safe. Tell me what's going on. She looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously. I can't. Mike sighed inwardly. He was tired, he wanted to go home, and he didn't want to deal with a drawn-out drama. He tried a different approach, the one that usually worked with stubborn kids. Look, Emma, I understand you're upset, but running away isn't the answer. Whatever's going on at home, we can work it out. I'm sure your parents are worried sick about you. He expected her to argue, to protest, but she just went silent, her shoulders slumping in defeat. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not just fear, but a deep, bone-chilling terror. It gave him a momentary pause, a prickle of unease, but he dismissed it. He'd seen kids act out in all sorts of ways. Come on, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Let's get you home. He gently took her arm, guiding her towards the patrol car. She didn't resist, but she didn't cooperate either. She moved like a sleepwalker, her gaze fixed on the ground. Mike opened the back door, and she slid onto the seat, her small body seeming to disappear in the vastness of the car. He closed the door, the metallic clang echoing in the quiet park. He had a form to fill out, a runaway report, but he decided to do it later. Right now, he just wanted to get this over with. He got back in the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the park, leaving the empty swing swaying gently in the night breeze. The silence in the car was heavy, punctuated only by Emma's occasional sniffles. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her face a pale blur in the darkness. He tried to reassure himself that he was doing the right thing, but the unease he'd felt earlier lingered, a tiny, nagging voice in the back of his mind. The drive to Emma's house was short, no more than 10 minutes. As they turned onto her street, Mike noticed it was a typical middle-class neighborhood, with neat lawns and modest, two-story houses. The kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. He pulled up in front of a house with a well-tended garden and a basketball hoop in the driveway. The porch light was on, casting a warm, inviting glow. It looked like a picture-perfect American home. But Emma's reaction shattered the image. As soon as she saw the house, she recoiled, pressing herself against the car door as if trying to melt into the seat. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, her eyes wide with panic. "Emma, what's wrong?" Mike asked, turning to face her. She didn't answer, just stared at the house with a look of pure dread. He saw her hands trembling, and she was biting her lower lip so hard he thought it might bleed. This wasn't just teenage angst. This was something far more profound. The front door of the house opened, and a man stepped out onto the porch. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a receding hairline and a stern expression. He was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, his arms crossed over his chest. "Emma," he called out, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Is that you?" Emma flinched at the sound of his voice, shrinking further into the seat. Mike felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about the man's demeanor, the way he stood there, the contrast between his gentle tone and Emma's terror, set off alarm bells in his head. Mike got out of the car and walked around to the back, opening the door for Emma. She hesitated, her eyes pleading with him. He felt a surge of conflicting emotions, sympathy for the girl, a growing suspicion about the situation, and an ingrained duty to reunite a child with her family. "Come on, Emma," he said, his voice softer than before. "Let's talk to your dad." He didn't know if the man was her father, but he used the term hoping to ease her fear. Emma reluctantly got out of the car, her legs shaky. She walked towards the house like she was walking to her execution. The man came down the steps, his smile fading as he got closer to Emma. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice still gentle, but with an undercurrent of something Mike couldn't quite identify. "Your mother and I have been worried sick." I went for a walk," Emma mumbled, her eyes fixed on the ground. "A walk? At this time of night? In the cold?" The man's voice rose slightly. He reached out and took Emma's arm, his grip firm. "You know you're not supposed to be out alone." It was then that Mike saw it. As the man pulled Emma closer, the sleeve of her t-shirt rode up, revealing a series of purplish bruises on her wrist. They looked like finger marks, as if someone had grabbed her hard, repeatedly. The sight sent a jolt of adrenaline through Mike. He instinctively stepped forward. "Sir," Mike said, his voice firm and authoritative. "I'm Officer Harrison. I found your daughter wandering in Creekside Park." She seemed distressed. The man turned to Mike, his expression shifting from concern to annoyance. "I'm Robert Miller, Emma's stepfather. She does this sometimes. Runs off when she's upset. Teenagers, you know." He gave a forced chuckle. Mike didn't smile back. He kept his gaze fixed on Robert Miller, his mind racing. The bruises, Emma's terror, the man's forced casualness, it all added up to something deeply wrong. "Mr. Miller, I need to ask you a few questions," Mike said. Privately. Robert Miller hesitated, his eyes flickering with suspicion. "About what?" "About Emma's well-being," Mike said, his tone leaving no room for argument. A woman appeared in the doorway, her face etched with worry. She was slender, with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she looked tired. "Robert, what's going on?" she asked. "Is Emma okay?" "She's fine, honey," Robert said, his voice softening again. "Just a little misunderstanding. Go back inside. I'll handle this." The woman looked from Robert to Emma, then to Mike. She seemed hesitant, but she obeyed her husband, disappearing back into the house. Mike waited until she was gone, then turned back to Robert Miller. "Mr. Miller, I saw bruises on Emma's wrist. Can you explain those?" Robert Miller's face hardened. "She fell. She's clumsy. Always has been." Mike didn't believe him. He knew the difference between accidental bruises and those caused by force. "Mr. Miller, I'm going to need to speak with Emma alone, and I'm going to need to see her room." Robert Miller's eyes narrowed. You have no right to do that. You need a warrant. I can get a warrant, Mike said, his voice low and steady. But it would be a lot easier if you cooperated. He knew he was pushing the limits of his authority, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Emma was in danger. He had to do something. He stood his ground, his hand resting on his holster, not in a threatening way, but as a reminder of his authority. The two men stared at each other, a silent battle of wills. The porch light cast long shadows, making the scene feel even more ominous. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the chirping of crickets. Mike knew he was at a crossroads. He could walk away, file his report, and pretend he hadn't seen anything. Or he could follow his gut, risk his career, and possibly save a young girl's life. He thought of Emma's terrified eyes, the bruises on her wrist, and the knot in his stomach tightened. He knew what he had to do. The drive back to the station was a blur. Mike's mind was racing, replaying the encounter at Emma's house over and over again. Robert Miller's forced smile, his evasiveness, the way he tried to control the situation, it all screamed red flags. And then there were the bruises, those undeniable marks of violence. He couldn't shake the image of Emma's terrified face, her silent plea for help. He arrived at the station, a small, unassuming building that served as the headquarters for Havenwood's police force. The night shift was in full swing, the dispatch room buzzing with activity, officers coming and going, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and nervous energy. Mike walked past the holding cells, where a couple of drunks were sleeping it off, and headed straight for his desk, a cluttered space in the corner of the squad room. He sat down heavily, the weight of the evening settling on him. He needed to file his report, but he couldn't bring himself to write it off as a simple runaway case. He pulled up the form on his computer, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He typed in the basic information: Emma's name, address, the time of the incident, but when it came to the narrative, he hesitated. He couldn't just write, "Found juvenile female wandering in park. Returned her to her parents." That would be a lie, a betrayal of his instincts, and potentially a death sentence for Emma. His colleague, Officer Dave Reynolds, a younger officer with a jovial personality, walked by, pausing at Mike's desk. "Rough night, Mike?" he asked, noticing Mike's grim expression. Mike looked up, considering whether to confide in Dave. He trusted Dave, but he also knew that some of the older officers on the force were quick to dismiss child abuse allegations, especially if they involved seemingly normal families. "Had a call about a runaway," Mike said, keeping his tone neutral. "Creekside Park." "Odd, the usual Friday night fun," Dave said with a chuckle. "Did you bring her home?" "Yeah," Mike said, his voice tight. But something didn't feel right. Dave's smile faded. "What do you mean?" Mike hesitated, then decided to share his concerns. He described Emma's fear, the bruises on her wrist, Robert Miller's demeanor. Dave listened intently, his expression growing serious. "Sounds fishy, Mike," Dave said when Mike finished. "Did you report it?" "Not yet," Mike said. "I wanted to get your take on it." "My take? Trust your gut, old man. You've been doing this long enough to know when something's not right. Bruises like that, that's not a fall. That's someone grabbing her." Mike nodded, relieved that Dave saw it the same way. "I wanted to go back check on her, but Miller wasn't cooperative. Said I needed a warrant." "He's right, technically," Dave said. "But you could try talking to the mom. Maybe she'll let you in. Or you could talk to Child Protective Services, get them involved." Mike considered his options. Talking to the mother was a possibility, but he wasn't sure how much help she would be. She seemed intimidated by her husband, and she might not be willing to go against him. Contacting CPS was the logical next step, but he knew it could take time to get them to investigate, and time was something Emma might not have. Another officer, Sergeant Johnson, a gruff, no-nonsense veteran who was nearing retirement, walked by and overheard their conversation. He stopped at Mike's desk, his expression skeptical. "What's this about a runaway?" Johnson asked, his voice raspy. Mike repeated the story, trying to keep his tone objective, but he could feel Johnson's disapproval radiating off him. "So, you let a teenage girl's sob story get to you?" Johnson said, his tone dismissive. "They run away all the time. It's usually just drama. Hormones, you know." Mike bristled at Johnson's dismissive attitude. "Sergeant, I saw bruises on her wrist. Finger marks." And the stepfather, he was acting strange. Johnson waved his hand dismissively. "Look, Harrison, I know you mean well, but you're letting your emotions get the better of you. We get calls like this all the time. 9 times out of 10, it's nothing. The parents are just trying to discipline their kids, and the kids overreact. But what if this is the 1 time out of 10, Mike argued, his voice rising slightly. What if she's really in danger? Johnson sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, I understand your concern, but we can't go around raiding people's houses based on a hunch. We need evidence, probable cause. You said it yourself. The stepfather told you you'd need a warrant. I know, Mike said, frustration creeping into his voice. But I can't just shake this feeling. You need to learn to control your feelings, Harrison, Johnson said sternly. This job is about facts, not feelings. File your report, document everything, and if you're really that concerned, contact CPS. Let them handle it. That's what they're there for. Johnson walked away, leaving Mike feeling even more conflicted. He knew Johnson was right, in a way. He couldn't just barge into someone's house without proper cause. But he also couldn't ignore the evidence he'd seen with his own eyes, the fear he'd witnessed in Emma's face. He spent the rest of his shift wrestling with his conscience. He tried to focus on other tasks, responding to minor traffic violations and noise complaints, but Emma's image kept haunting him. He kept replaying the conversation with Robert Miller, the way the man had tried to deflect his questions, the way he tried to isolate Emma. As he drove around, he found himself unconsciously heading back towards Emma's neighborhood. He told himself he was just patrolling the area, ensuring everything was quiet, but he knew he was looking for an excuse, a reason to go back to that house. He drove past the house slowly, his eyes scanning the windows. The lights were off, the house dark and silent. He saw no sign of activity. He parked a few blocks away, in the shadows, and just watched. He sat there for over an hour, his mind churning, his gut twisting. He knew he was being irrational, that he was letting his emotions cloud his judgment, but he couldn't help himself. He thought about calling CPS directly, but he hesitated. He knew the system. It was slow, bureaucratic, and often overwhelmed. It could take days, even weeks, for them to respond, and by then, it might be too late. He imagined Emma, alone in that house, with the man who had left those bruises on her wrist. The thought made him sick to his stomach. He finally decided to call it a night. He drove back to the station, feeling defeated and exhausted. He filed his report, carefully documenting everything he'd seen and heard, emphasizing the bruises and Emma's fear. He made a note to contact CPS first thing in the morning, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. He knew he wouldn't be able to sleep. Sleep didn't come. Mike tossed and turned in his bed, his mind replaying the events of the evening like a broken record. Emma's face, pale and tear-streaked, was burned into his memory. The bruises on her wrist, a stark testament to violence, haunted him. He kept hearing her whispered plea, "Please, don't take me home." He got out of bed, went to the kitchen, and made a pot of coffee, even though he knew it wouldn't help. He paced back and forth, his restless energy filling the small apartment. He looked at the clock on the microwave, 3:17 a.m. He'd been off duty for hours, but he felt like he was still on the clock, still responsible for Emma's safety. He tried to rationalize his feelings. He told himself he was overreacting, that he was letting his emotions get the best of him. He reminded himself of Sergeant Johnson's words, "This job is about facts, not feelings." But the facts, as he saw them, were terrifying. A young girl, terrified of her home, with visible signs of abuse. A stepfather who was evasive and controlling. A mother who seemed powerless to intervene. He thought about his own daughter, Sarah, who was now grown and living on her own. He remembered the fierce protectiveness he'd felt for her when she was young, the lengths he would have gone to keep her safe. He couldn't imagine Sarah being in Emma's situation, alone and afraid, with no one to turn to. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts, looking for the number for Child Protective Services. He knew he should call, let them handle it. But he also knew the limitations of the system. He'd seen cases fall through the cracks, children slip through the safety net. He couldn't let that happen to Emma. He put the phone down, his decision made. He couldn't wait for CPS. He couldn't wait for a warrant. He had to go back. He knew he was risking his career, that he could be reprimanded, suspended, even fired. But he didn't care. He had to know if Emma was safe. He got dressed quickly, putting on his uniform, even though he wasn't officially on duty. He felt a sense of urgency, a need to act before it was too late. He grabbed his keys and his service weapon, his heart pounding in his chest. As he drove back towards Emma's neighborhood, he tried to come up with a plan. He couldn't just barge into the house. He needed a reason, a pretext. He thought about pretending to be following up on the runaway report, asking to speak with Emma again. But he knew Robert Miller wouldn't let him near her. He decided to try a different approach. He would talk to the neighbors, see if they'd seen or heard anything suspicious. Maybe they'd noticed something, a pattern of behavior, that would give him enough cause to intervene. He parked a few blocks away from Emma's house, wanting to avoid being seen by Robert Miller. It was still dark, the streets deserted. The only sound was the occasional bark of a dog or the rumble of a distant truck. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the houses, looking for any sign of life. He approached the house next door to Emma's, a modest bungalow with a neatly trimmed lawn. He hesitated, then rang the doorbell. He waited, his heart pounding. He heard movement inside. Then the porch light flicked on. An elderly woman, her hair in curlers, peered out through the peephole. Mike held up his badge, trying to look as official and non-threatening as possible. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm and respectful. "I'm Officer Harrison with the Havenwood Police Department. I'm investigating a report of a runaway child next door. I was wondering if you'd seen or heard anything unusual." The woman opened the door a crack, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What kind of unusual?" she asked. Mike explained the situation, keeping his tone neutral, focusing on Emma's well-being. He mentioned the bruises, but he didn't accuse Robert Miller directly. He just wanted to see if the woman had noticed anything that might corroborate his suspicions. The woman listened intently, her expression growing concerned. "I've heard them arguing," she said finally. "Loud voices, sometimes shouting. And the girl, she always seems so sad. I've seen her in the yard a few times, and she never smiles. She just keeps to herself." This was something. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to reinforce Mike's concerns. He thanked the woman for her time and moved on to the next house. He spent the next hour talking to several neighbors, gathering bits and pieces of information. One neighbor had seen Emma with bruises on her arms before. Another had heard crying coming from the house late at night. Another mentioned that Robert Miller had a reputation for being short-tempered. The picture that emerged was increasingly disturbing. It wasn't just a one-time incident, it was a pattern of behavior, a consistent picture of a troubled household. Mike felt a growing sense of urgency. He knew he had to act, and he had to act now. He had enough. He was going back to the house. Armed with the neighbors' statements, Mike felt a renewed sense of purpose, but also a heightened awareness of the risk. He couldn't just storm into the house. He needed a more subtle approach, a way to assess the situation without alerting Robert Miller. He decided to start with observation. He drove back towards Emma's house, parking a block away, where he could see the front of the house without being easily noticed. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the neighborhood. The houses were still mostly dark, the streets quiet. He watched the house intently, looking for any sign of movement. He saw a light go on in an upstairs window, then another. He couldn't tell which rooms they were, but he assumed one of them was Emma's. He imagined her waking up, starting another day in fear. The thought made his blood boil. He waited, his patience wearing thin. He needed to see something, anything, that would give him a clear justification to intervene. He considered calling for backup, but he hesitated. He didn't want to escalate the situation unnecessarily, and he still wasn't sure how his colleagues would react. He felt like he was walking a tightrope, balancing his duty to protect Emma with the need to follow procedure. After about an hour, he saw the front door open. Robert Miller stepped out, dressed in casual clothes, holding a newspaper. He walked down the driveway to the mailbox, retrieved the mail, and went back inside. He didn't look around, didn't seem to notice Mike watching him. Mike's heart sank. He hadn't seen Emma. He hadn't seen anything that would justify immediate action. He was starting to doubt himself, wondering if he was making a mistake. Maybe Johnson was right. Maybe he was letting his emotions get the better of him. Then he saw it. As Robert Miller was closing the front door, Mike caught a glimpse of Emma standing in the hallway. She was wearing a long-sleeved shirt, despite the warming weather, and her head was down. She looked small and vulnerable, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Mike saw the same fear he'd seen the night before, but this time, there was something else, a flicker of hope, a silent plea for help. That was all Mike needed. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had to get into that house. He decided on a risky gambit. He would approach the house directly, pretending to be following up on the runaway report, and try to get Emma's mother to let him in. He knew it was a long shot, but he had to try. He got out of his car and walked towards the house, his hand resting on his holster, not in a threatening way, but as a precaution. He walked with purpose, trying to project an air of authority and confidence, even though his heart was pounding in his chest. He reached the front door and rang the doorbell. He waited, listening for any sound from inside. He heard footsteps. Then the door opened. It was Emma's mother, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed. She looked even more tired than she had the night before. "Officer Harrison," she said, her voice surprised. "What are you doing here?" "Ma'am," Mike said, his voice calm and respectful. "I need to follow up on the report from last night. I'm concerned about Emma's well-being. I need to speak with her again, alone." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting nervously towards the interior of the house. I don't know," she said. "My husband." "Ma'am, I understand your hesitation," Mike said, his voice gentle but firm. "But I have reason to believe Emma may be in danger. I've spoken with your neighbors, and they've expressed concerns about her well-being." He saw a flicker of fear in the woman's eyes. He knew she was torn between her loyalty to her husband and her concern for her daughter. He pressed his advantage. "Ma'am, I just need a few minutes to talk to Emma, to make sure she's okay. If everything is fine, I'll leave, and I won't bother you again. But if she's not okay, I need to help her." The woman looked at him, her eyes searching his face. She seemed to be weighing her options, calculating the risks. Finally, she took a deep breath and nodded. "Come in," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But please, be discreet. My husband, he doesn't like people interfering in our family business." Mike stepped inside, his senses on high alert. He followed the woman down a short hallway, towards the back of the house. He heard the sound of a television coming from a living room, but he didn't see Robert Miller. "Where's Emma?" Mike asked, his voice low. "In her room," the woman said. "At the end of the hall." They reached a closed door at the end of the hallway. The woman hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She looked at Mike, her eyes pleading. "Please," she whispered. "Be careful." Mike nodded, his heart pounding. He took a deep breath and opened the door. The room was small and dimly lit, the curtains drawn, casting the space in a perpetual twilight. Emma was sitting on the edge of her bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up as Mike entered, her eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in fear. "It's okay, Emma," Mike said softly, closing the door behind him. "I'm here to help you." Emma didn't say anything, just stared at him, her body tense. The room was sparsely furnished with a single bed, a small dresser, a desk with a few schoolbooks. It looked like a typical teenager's room, but there was something off about it, something that made Mike's skin crawl. He noticed that the doorknob on the outside of the door had a lock, the kind you would see on a bathroom door, not a bedroom door. He looked closer and saw faint scratch marks around the lock, as if someone had tried to force it open. "Emma," Mike said, his voice gentle. "Can you tell me what's been going on?" Emma hesitated, her eyes darting towards the door, as if she was afraid someone would overhear. I can't," she whispered. "Emma, I know you're scared," Mike said, "but I'm here to help you. I saw the bruises on your wrist last night, and I've talked to your neighbors. They're worried about you." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she still didn't speak. Mike knelt down in front of her, trying to make himself less intimidating. "Emma, please," he said. "You need to tell me what's happening. Is your stepfather hurting you?" Emma finally nodded, a single tear rolling down her cheek. He locks me in here," she whispered. He hurts me." Mike felt a surge of anger, a burning rage that threatened to consume him. He forced himself to remain calm, to focus on Emma. "How does he hurt you, Emma?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma hesitated again, her body trembling. She pulled up the sleeves of her long-sleeved shirt, revealing more bruises, not just on her wrists, but also on her forearms. They were different shades of purple and yellow, indicating that they were from different times. He ties me up, she whispered. She couldn't finish the sentence, her body shaking with sobs. Mike didn't need her to finish. He knew. He'd seen enough cases like this to know the horrifying truth. He looked around the room again, his eyes scanning for more evidence. He noticed a small, almost imperceptible stain on the carpet near the bed. It looked like blood. He felt a chill run down his spine. He walked over to the dresser and cautiously opened the drawers. They were mostly empty, containing only a few items of clothing. He noticed that there were no personal items, no pictures, no trinkets, nothing that would indicate this was a young girl's room. It was as if her personality had been erased. He then went to the closet. It was small and cramped, and it contained more of Emma's clothes. He ran hand along inside of the closet and found small hole. He looked closer and noticed small device. He carefully removed it. He looked closely and found out that it was hidden camera. Mike felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He knew he had to get Emma out of there. Now, Emma, he said, his voice firm but gentle. I'm going to get you out of here. You're going to be safe. He helped her up from the bed, his hand on her arm, reassuring her. He led her towards the door, his mind racing. He needed to get her out of the house without alerting Robert Miller. He didn't know where Miller was, but he assumed he was still in the living room, watching television. He opened the door slowly, peering out into the hallway. It was empty. He motioned for Emma to follow him, and they tiptoed towards the front door. As they passed the living room, Mike heard the sound of the television, the volume turned up. As they passed the living room, Mike heard the sound of the television, the volume turned up loud. He risked a quick glance inside and saw Robert Miller sitting on the couch, his back to them, seemingly engrossed in whatever was on the screen. Mike's heart pounded in his chest. He knew they were just seconds away from freedom, but those seconds felt like an eternity. He reached the front door, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. He turned it slowly, trying to avoid making any noise. The door clicked open, and he pulled it open just wide enough for them to slip through. "Come on, Emma," he whispered, urging her forward. They stepped out onto the porch, into the bright morning sunlight. Emma blinked, as if she hadn't seen the sun in days. Mike closed the door behind them, gently, silently. He took Emma's hand and led her down the steps, towards his patrol car. As they walked, Mike kept glancing back at the house, expecting Robert Miller to appear at any moment. But the house remained silent, the windows dark and unseeing. They reached the patrol car, and Mike opened the back door for Emma. She hesitated, looking back at the house, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "It's okay, Emma," Mike reassured her. "You're safe now. He can't hurt you anymore." Emma got into the car, her small body sinking into the seat. Mike closed the door, the sound echoing in the quiet street. He got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. As he drove, he looked at Emma in the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, her face pale and expressionless. He knew she was in shock, that the reality of what had happened hadn't fully sunk in yet. He reached for his radio, his hand shaking. He needed to call for backup, to report what he'd found, to get Emma to a safe place. He also knew that he was about to face a firestorm of scrutiny, that his actions would be questioned, that his career might be on the line. But he didn't care. He'd done what he had to do. He'd saved a young girl's life. "Dispatch," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "This is Unit 4. I need immediate backup at 12 Oak Street. I have a confirmed case of child abuse. Suspect is Robert Miller, at the residence. I have the victim with me, requesting medical assistance and child protective services." The dispatcher's voice crackled back, 10-4, Unit 4. Backup is en route. At 5 minutes. CPS has been notified. Mike acknowledged the response, then looked back at Emma. She was still staring out the window, her body rigid. He wanted to say something, to offer her some comfort, but he didn't know what to say. Words seemed inadequate in the face of such profound trauma. He decided to drive to a nearby park, a quiet, secluded spot where they could wait for backup without attracting attention. He parked under a large oak tree, the shade providing a sense of privacy and protection. He turned off the engine, and the silence descended, broken only by the chirping of birds and the distant hum of traffic. He turned to Emma, his heart aching for her. "Emma," he said softly, "are you okay?" She didn't answer, just continued to stare out the window. He reached out and gently touched her arm. She flinched, her body recoiling from his touch. "It's okay, Emma," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to protect you." She slowly turned to face him, her eyes filled with tears. He said he would kill me if I told anyone," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mike felt a surge of anger, a righteous fury that burned through him. "He's not going to kill you, Emma," he said, his voice firm. "He's going to jail. He's never going to hurt you again." He saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, a faint glimmer of trust. It was a small victory, but it was enough. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult for Emma, but he was determined to be there for her, to help her heal, to help her find justice. He sat there with her in silence, waiting for backup, listening to the birds sing, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. He was exhausted, emotionally drained, but he also felt a sense of profound satisfaction. He'd done the right thing. He'd listened to his instincts. He'd saved a life. And that, he knew, was all that mattered. The arrival of backup was swift and decisive. Two patrol cars, sirens wailing, pulled up beside Mike's car, followed by an ambulance. Officers jumped out, their faces grim, their hands on their weapons. Mike quickly briefed them on the situation, pointing towards the house and emphasizing the need for caution. He introduced them to Detective Isabella Z. Ramirez, a sharp, experienced investigator specializing in child abuse cases. She was a petite woman with fiery dark eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She had arrived with the CPS caseworker, a kind-faced woman named Sarah Jenkins. "Officer Harrison," Detective Ramirez said, her voice brisk and professional, "walk me through what you found." Mike recounted the events of the past 24 hours, starting with the initial call about the runaway, his growing suspicion, the neighbor's statements, and finally, the horrifying discovery in Emma's room. He handed Detective Ramirez the hidden camera he had confiscated. Detective Ramirez examined the camera, her expression hardening. "This is damning," she said. "This is enough to get us a warrant, and then some." While the other officers secured the perimeter of the house, Detective Ramirez and Sarah Jenkins focused on Emma. They spoke to her gently, reassuring her that she was safe, asking her questions in a calm and non-threatening manner. Emma was still withdrawn, but she was slowly starting to open up, answering their questions in a soft, hesitant voice. Mike watched them, his heart aching for Emma. He knew the trauma she had endured would take a long time to heal, but he was grateful that she was finally getting the help she needed. Detective Ramirez turned to Mike. "You did good, Harrison," she said, her tone softening slightly. "You followed your instincts, and you saved this girl's life. I know you went in there without a warrant, and that's going to raise some eyebrows, but I'll back you up. We'll make sure this sticks." Mike nodded, relieved to have her support. He knew he'd taken a risk, but he didn't regret it. "We need to get a warrant to search the house thoroughly," Detective Ramirez said. "And we need to get a statement from Emma, as detailed as possible. We also need to get her to a hospital for a medical examination." She turned to Sarah Jenkins. "Sarah, can you take Emma to the hospital? I'll stay here and coordinate the search." Sarah Jenkins nodded, gently guiding Emma towards the ambulance. Emma looked back at Mike, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. He gave her a reassuring nod, letting her know he would be there for her. As the ambulance drove away, Detective Ramirez turned back to Mike. "Harrison, I need you to write up a detailed report. Everything you saw, everything you heard, everything you did. Don't leave anything out. This is going to be a high-profile case, and we need to make sure we have all our bases covered." Mike nodded, knowing that the next few hours, days, even weeks, would be crucial. He would have to relive the events over and over again, answering questions, providing testimony, facing scrutiny from his superiors and possibly even the media. But he was ready. He was prepared to do whatever it took to ensure that Robert Miller was brought to justice. He went back to his patrol car and started writing his report, his mind racing to recall every detail, every nuance, every piece of evidence. He described Emma's fear, the bruises, the locked room, the blood stain on the carpet, the hidden camera. He wrote about the neighbors' statements, their concerns about Emma's well-being, their observations of Robert Miller's behavior. As he wrote, he realized the magnitude of the case, the complexity of the legal challenges ahead. He knew that Robert Miller would likely hire a good lawyer, that they would try to discredit Emma, to paint her as a troubled teenager, a liar, a runaway. He knew that they would try to challenge the legality of his entry into the house, to suppress the evidence he had found. But he also knew that he had truth on his side. He had Emma's testimony, the physical evidence, the neighbors' statements, and unwavering support of Detective Ramirez. He was confident that they would be able to build a strong case, a case that would put Robert Miller behind bars for a long time. He looked forward to the day Robert would stand trial. While Mike meticulously documented his account, Detective Ramirez orchestrated the securing of a search warrant. The judge, after reviewing the preliminary evidence and Mike's affidavit, swiftly authorized the warrant, recognizing the urgency and gravity of the situation. The forensic team arrived, their van bristling with equipment. They donned protective suits and gloves, their movements precise and methodical. They began their meticulous examination of Emma's room, photographing every detail, collecting samples, and documenting their findings. The blood stain on the carpet was confirmed to be human blood. They carefully bagged the hidden camera, along with any SD cards or storage devices they could find. Every item, no matter how seemingly insignificant, was treated as potential evidence. Detective Ramirez, meanwhile, focused on interviewing Robert Miller. Miller, initially defiant and claiming ignorance, quickly crumbled under her relentless questioning. He initially denied everything, sticking to his story that Emma was a troubled child who frequently ran away and made up stories. However, faced with the mounting evidence, the neighbors' testimonies, the camera, and the forensic findings in Emma's room, his facade began to crack. Ramirez expertly played on his inconsistencies, his lies, and his attempts to deflect blame. She presented him with the evidence, piece by piece, dismantling his carefully constructed narrative. She was a master of interrogation, knowing when to be aggressive, when to be empathetic, and when to simply let the silence do the work. While Ramirez dealt with Miller, Mike focused on gathering additional corroborating evidence. He revisited the neighbors, obtaining formal written statements from each of them. He delved into Robert Miller's background, searching for any prior complaints, arrests, or allegations of violence or inappropriate behavior. He discovered a previous restraining order filed against Miller by an ex-girlfriend, citing threats and physical aggression. This information, though not directly related to Emma's case, helped paint a picture of Miller's character and propensity for violence. Mike also tracked down Emma's school records, looking for any signs of trouble, any reports of unusual behavior or injuries. He found that Emma's grades had been declining steadily over the past year, and she had missed several days of school without explanation. He interviewed Emma's teachers, who described her as a quiet, withdrawn girl who seemed increasingly isolated and afraid. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, forming a comprehensive and damning picture of Robert Miller's abuse. The evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecution's case was growing stronger by the hour. As the day wore on, the tension mounted. The media had caught wind of the story, and reporters were swarming the neighborhood, clamoring for information. Mike and Ramirez had to be careful not to reveal any details that could compromise the investigation or jeopardize Emma's privacy. Late that evening, after hours of intense questioning, Robert Miller finally broke. He confessed to abusing Emma, admitting to locking her in her room, tying her up, and filming his horrific acts. He claimed he lost control, that he didn't mean to hurt her, but his words rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence. Detective Ramirez placed Robert Miller under arrest, charging him with multiple counts of aggravated sexual assault, child endangerment, and unlawful restraint. As Miller was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of defeat, Mike felt a sense of grim satisfaction. Justice was being served, but the victory felt bittersweet. He knew that Emma's journey to recovery would be long and arduous, and the scars of her trauma would likely never fully heal. The days following Robert Miller's arrest were a whirlwind of activity. Emma was placed in the temporary care of a specialized foster home, a safe and supportive environment designed for children who had experienced severe trauma. She was assigned a therapist, Dr. Emily Carter, a compassionate and experienced psychologist who specialized in treating victims of child abuse. Mike visited Emma at the foster home a few days after the rescue. He was nervous and sure of how she would react to seeing him again. He brought her a small stuffed animal, a soft, cuddly bear, hoping it might offer some small comfort. He found Emma sitting in a sunny playroom, drawing with crayons. She looked up as he entered, her eyes widening slightly. She didn't smile, but there was a flicker of recognition, a hint of trust. "Hi, Emma," Mike said softly, approaching her slowly. "I brought you something." He held out the stuffed bear. Emma looked at it for a moment, then reached out and took it, her fingers brushing against his. She held the bear close, her eyes fixed on it. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mike sat down on a small chair across from her. "How are you doing, Emma?" he asked. She shrugged, her gaze still fixed on the bear. "Okay, I guess." "It's okay to not be okay, Emma," Mike said. "What you went through, it was terrible. But you're safe now. And you're going to get help." Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "Dr. Carter, she's nice," she said. "She helps me talk about it." "That's good, Emma," Mike said. "Talking about it is important. It helps you heal." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the scratching of crayons on paper. Mike watched Emma draw, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw a spark of resilience in her, a determination to overcome the trauma she had endured. "I'm sorry, Emma," Mike said finally, his voice filled with emotion. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you at first. I should have listened to you." Emma looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "It's okay," she said. "You saved me. That's all that matters." Mike's heart swelled with emotion. He had made a mistake, a potentially fatal one, but he had also made amends. He had saved a young girl's life, and he had given her a chance to heal, to rebuild, to find happiness. He stayed with Emma for another hour, talking, drawing, and simply being present. He didn't push her to talk about the abuse, but he let her know that he was there for her whenever she needed him. As he left the foster home, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that Emma's journey to recovery would be long and difficult, but he was committed to supporting her every step of the way. He would be there for her court appearances, her therapy sessions, her triumphs, and her setbacks. He would be her advocate, her protector, her friend. He drove back to the station with determination. He will be there for Emma. The legal process was a grueling ordeal, a slow and often frustrating march towards justice. Robert Miller, represented by a high-powered defense attorney, pleaded not guilty to all charges. The defense strategy was predictable: discredit Emma, portray her as a troubled teenager with a history of lying and running away, and challenge the legality of Mike's entry into the house. The preliminary hearing was a tense affair. Mike testified, recounting the events leading up to the rescue, his observations, and his discovery of the evidence. He faced intense cross-examination from Miller's attorney, who tried to paint him as an overzealous officer who had violated Miller's rights. Mike held his ground, answering the questions calmly and truthfully, sticking to the facts, and emphasizing Emma's fear and the visible signs of abuse. Detective Ramirez also testified, presenting the forensic evidence, the neighbor's statements, and Miller's confession. She was unwavering under cross-examination, expertly deflecting the defense attorney's attempts to undermine the credibility of the investigation. Emma, however, was the star witness. Despite her initial reluctance and fear, she bravely took the stand, her small voice trembling but firm. She recounted the horrors she had endured, describing Miller's abuse in graphic detail. She spoke of the fear, the pain, the isolation, and the feeling of being trapped. Her testimony was heartbreaking, but it was also incredibly powerful. The courtroom was silent as she spoke, her words hanging in the air like a heavy shroud. Even the most hardened reporters were visibly moved. The defense attorney tried to rattle her, to confuse her, to make her contradict herself. But Emma, guided by Dr. Carter's therapy and supported by Mike's presence in the courtroom, held strong. She answered the questions honestly, even when they were painful and embarrassing. She looked directly at Miller, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. The judge, after hearing all the evidence, ruled that there was sufficient probable cause to proceed to trial. Robert Miller was bound over for trial on all charges. The trial itself was a media circus. The courtroom was packed with reporters, cameras, and spectators. The case had captured the public's attention, becoming a symbol of the hidden horrors of child abuse and the importance of listening to children's cries for help. Mike testified again, recounting the events in even greater detail. He was subjected to even more intense cross-examination, but he remained steadfast, his testimony unwavering. Detective Ramirez presented the overwhelming evidence, leaving no doubt in the jury's mind about Miller's guilt. Emma, once again, took the stand. This time, she was even stronger, even more confident. She spoke with clarity and conviction, her voice filled with a newfound strength. She had faced her abuser, and she had survived. She was no longer a victim, she was a survivor. The defense attorney's attempts to discredit Emma fell flat. The jury saw through the lies and the manipulations. They saw Emma for who she was, a brave young girl who had endured unimaginable horrors and who was now fighting for justice. The prosecution presented expert witnesses, psychologists who testified about the effects of child abuse, the patterns of behavior exhibited by abusers, and the long-term consequences for victims. They explained Emma's initial reluctance to disclose the abuse, her fear, her shame, and her gradual process of healing. The defense called character witnesses for Miller, people who testified about his good character, his kindness, his respectability, but their testimony was weak and unconvincing in the face of the overwhelming evidence against him. The closing arguments were powerful and emotional. The prosecutor painted a vivid picture of Miller's depravity, his cruelty, and his betrayal of trust. He urged the jury to deliver justice for Emma, to send a message that child abuse would not be tolerated. The defense attorney argued that the case was based on circumstantial evidence, that there was no proof of Miller's guilt, that Emma was a troubled teenager who had made up the story to get attention. He pleaded with the jury to acquit his client. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the courtroom was silent, the tension palpable. The foreman read the verdict, guilty on all counts. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Emma, sitting beside Mike and Sarah Jenkins, burst into tears, tears of relief, tears of joy, tears of vindication. Mike put his arm around her, his own eyes welling up. Justice had been served. Robert Miller was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was led away in shackles, his face devoid of emotion, his future shattered. The years that followed were a testament to Emma's resilience and the power of healing. With the unwavering support of Dr. Carter, her foster family, and Mike, she gradually began to rebuild her life. She continued therapy, working through the trauma she had endured, learning coping mechanisms, and slowly regaining her sense of self-worth. She excelled in school, discovering a passion for art and music. She made friends, formed healthy relationships, and learned to trust again. She blossomed into a confident, compassionate young woman, determined to use her experience to help others. She eventually went to college, studying social work, with the goal of becoming a therapist herself, specializing in helping victims of child abuse. She wanted to give back, to offer the same kind of support and guidance that she had received. Mike remained a constant presence in her life, a father figure, a mentor, a friend. He attended her high school graduation, her college graduation, and even walked her down the aisle when she married a kind and loving man. He was immensely proud of the woman she had become, the strength she had shown, and the resilience she had demonstrated. The case had a profound impact on Mike's life as well. He became a vocal advocate for child abuse prevention, speaking at schools and community events, sharing Emma's story, and urging people to listen to children, to trust their instincts, and to report any suspicions of abuse. He received numerous awards and commendations for his bravery and his dedication, but the greatest reward for him was seeing Emma thrive, seeing her overcome the horrors of her past and build a bright future. He often reflected on the case, on the lessons he had learned. He realized that he had almost made a terrible mistake, that he had almost dismissed Emma's cry for help. He had been tired, jaded, and ready to go home, but something, a nagging feeling, a gut instinct, had made him listen, and that had made all the difference. He learned the importance of trusting his instincts, of looking beyond the surface, of recognizing the subtle signs of abuse. He learned the power of empathy, of compassion, of simply being there for someone in need. He also learned about the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to heal from even the most profound trauma. He saw it in Emma, in her determination to overcome her past, to build a better future, and to help others. As he neared retirement, Mike looked back on his career with a sense of pride and satisfaction. He had made a difference. He had saved lives. He had brought justice to victims. And he had learned valuable lessons that would stay with him forever. He knew that Emma's story would continue to inspire him, to remind him of the importance of his work, and to encourage him to always listen, to always believe, and to always fight for the vulnerable. He would carry that lesson with him, always. He understood how important it is. The case changed him, changed Emma, and showed the true meaning of justice. It finished with the happy end, but reality showed them pain, and the pain that they overcame.